Could inflation prove more perilous to livelihoods than lockdown? Latest figures from France and its neighbors show light at the end of the public health crisis tunnel, but there's no time to celebrate. The recovery has spawned a bidding war over goods and raw materials that's canceled out wage hikes for an in-demand labor force. A blip to soon be forgotten when the global economy reaches its new cruising altitude, or is the new normal 1970s style stagflation? The escalation over Ukraine serves as a reminder that the planet's probably reached peak oil and that without fuel, in this case Russian gas, we're vulnerable to much more than coronaviruses. Same holds true for the prized rare minerals of the information age, like cobalt in our cell phones. How do ordinary citizens make do, and how do they react? Far from the truckers' convoys of Canada, we have a presidential election around the corner here in France. The campaign in the one-time land of the Yellow Vests movement has been mostly about identity politics so far. Is that all about to change? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the rise of inflation. With us, Denis Ferrand, Director General at financial analysts Rexicode. Thanks for being with us.
Please, you're welcome.
Philippe Vechter is Chief Economist at Ostrom Asset Management. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. Welcome.
And from Washington, France 24 correspondent Ketevan Gorgestani. How are you?
Hi, Francois. I'm good. Thanks.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. A whiff of a hint of a Russian drawdown at Ukraine's border, enough to ease oil prices this Tuesday that are still hovering above $90 a barrel. Here in France, record prices at the pump, a main reason why ordinary workers are feeling the pinch. Emerald Maxwell has more.
These factory workers are striking over pay, calling for a 4% raise. The food processing company they work for is profitable, but unions say management has only offered employees a 3% increase.
Last year we got nothing, which we accepted because it was COVID and it was a difficult period. But this year we have a right to 4%.
Calls which look set to grow. French companies with over 50 workers are required to engage in annual salary negotiations. And according to a study by Deloitte, this year they'll be granting increases of 2.2% on average. Employees working in industry can expect a rise of around 2.5%, 2.2% in the transport sector, and 2% in banking. But the rises won't keep up with inflation, currently running at 2.9%.
I got a raise last year, but it wasn't enough given the cost of living.
I'm expecting it to be at least equal to inflation.
Will you be disappointed if it's less?
Yes, definitely.
Companies are being cautious, says this expert, because some have yet to recover from the pandemic.
There is still a climate of uncertainty because costs are skyrocketing. There are shortages of some raw materials needed for production, and various markets are under pressure.
Pressure that's set to continue, with inflation in France expected to climb to around 3.5% by June.
So, Denis Ferrand, you have had record profits announced by many top companies in this country. And we're seeing with inflation, and we saw in that report, workers who are on strike because, their salaries are not keeping up. Is inequality imbalances, are they growing before our very eyes?
Yes, inequality is a topic. But also, first of all, I think we have to think of the increase of wages as regard to the evolution of the labor market. And what we can see on the labor market is a change in the ability of the wage earners to obtain increase in wages. I see more and more bottlenecks in a labor force. Let's say in industry as well as in construction industry, and also in some services in the tertiary sector. So when you are adding inflation, increase in inflation and the situation on the labor market, you have a good explanation to expect for a rise in wages. Also, you can add an increase in profit. In profit for big enterprises, this is not at all the same story for the whole enterprises in France. Okay, big enterprises have seen a rise in their profit, but not all the productive system have seen such an increase.
Okay, so the labor market is, as you say, getting heating up
Yes.
with what you call bottlenecks. Just explain to us what you mean by bottlenecks.
Bottleneck, I mean that enterprises have more and more difficulties to recruit, to find the workforce, to find people for working in their companies. This is not at the same level as we can see in the US, but when you're looking at the employment rate, I mean the share of people who are employed as a proportion of the total population, you are already on the top of the employment rate in France. I mean that you don't have so much people able to join enterprises right now. For sure, we still have about 6 million people who are on the job, who are still in Pôle emploi, the government agency for employment, and we are really have a question of mismatch between the skills required by enterprises and the skills that people can provide for a recruiter.
So, Philippe Vechtel, there are those that are not employable yet, but there are also those who found jobs. And as you just heard Denis mention, the unemployment rate in France is at its lowest level in decades. Still, if you have a job, you're still not, even though you've had probably a pay raise, it's not enough to keep up with inflation. So we're back to the same predicament we were before COVID, which is, that wages aren't keeping up with the cost of living.
Well, there are many problems on the labor market, and the link between labor market and inflation. People have seen that there are higher prices on gasoline, on food, and they say, "Well, I want to see my wage increase. I want to see my wage up because I can't pay for energy, for these high energy prices and for these high food prices." So that's that's what has determined their will to change and to negotiate higher wages. That's the first part. The other part is that on company side, there are many profits. The margin rate for companies in 2021 at a historical high, and people say, well, things are going well for companies, so we can have a part of this profit, and that's a negotiation we see where when people say,
we saw that we saw that last week when one of those companies announcing big profits was the energy giant Total Energy, and this as they're handing out home heating bills that are through the roof.
Yeah, but what Total said last week is to say, I want to limit the bulge of the energy price to my clients. I want to share with them. I will reduce the price of gasoline at the pump, and it didn't say I will share this profit with my own employees, and that's very different. And what people said is to say, well, things are going well for companies, and we as employers of this company, we need to share part of this profit. That's the source of this kind of social unrest we can see in companies. That's the point. And at the same time, we see that, as Denis mentioned, there are a lot of bottlenecks, a lot of companies who wanted to hire more people and who are not able to do that. So the labor market is changing, and the inflation, the perception of inflation is also changing for consumers, and that's how we have to manage this situation.
It's changing fast, in fact. And let me ask you, because the French presidential election is in April. Is it changing so fast that this is going to become the issue?
It can become the issue. We saw this morning in the newspaper that all candidates for the presidential election as a kind of recipe to increase wages, to increase revenues for employees. So you can have higher wages, but what people look at is higher premium to improve temporarily the revenue for employees. That's the way it will probably go. We will have premium to be defined, and but wages will increase very slowly, because when you have higher wages, it's for a long time. It's in the labor contract. When you have premium, when you have bonus, it's just for this year. And probably we will have many bonus this year, but not higher wages. That's the difference.
All right, so bonuses, but not built-in higher wages in your monthly paycheck.
Absolutely.
And as the French presidential election approaches, the country contending, as we said earlier, as we saw earlier in that report, with the prospect of 3.5% inflation. This graph shows you that, well, that's kind of in line with what we're seeing throughout much of Europe. The yellow line there is wages. The blue line is inflation and wages not keeping pace of late. And that's, of course, nothing compared with the United States. The United States contending with 7.5% inflation year on. It's enough. There you see the real wage growth, which has in fact started to dip a little, while the hourly earnings ratio is a little bit higher. And yeah, the inflation is going higher than those wage growth. This is enough to threaten Joe Biden's Build Back Better infrastructure and social spending plan as we head towards midterm elections. Ketevan Gorgistani, the inflation in the U.S., you can see it every time you fill the tank.
Yes, the gas prices, for example, jumping by 40% over the past year, between January 2021 and January 2022, a 40% increase. That is huge in a country, of course, that relies excessively on driving for Americans to get around, to go to work, to go grocery shopping, which is another place where you're seeing huge increases in the price of goods. And that's something that is felt directly in the pocket of Americans. If you take gas and groceries, that's really where Americans feel the pinch. And that has really been shown in Joe Biden's approval ratings that are at pretty much record lows. And when you ask Americans why they're not really happy with what Joe Biden is doing, especially if you talk to Democrats, they feel that he's doing a good job on other issues, but on the economy, they're simply not seeing the results of all the things that the Biden administration has done. So you have Joe Biden just last week. It was very interesting to see. He gave a speech touting about the increase in wages, touting the good economy, how it was bouncing back at the same time that we were getting that report of the 7.5% inflation rate, which was a 40-year record. And so there is an idea that there is a disconnect between how the Biden administration is viewing and presenting the economy and what Americans actually feel. And there's one more thing I'd like to add is that Joe Biden came into office wanting to work on inflation even before those record rates. But the thing is, his 72-point plan was aimed at fixing inflation on issues that were there before the COVID pandemic. He was focused on competition between companies, saying that the consolidation of power was mostly responsible for inflation. So the plan doesn't really address the issues created by COVID. We had some of your guests were mentioning the supply chain issues, the labor shortage, things like that, that are linked to COVID and that the Biden administration is not focused on right now. And so it seems that the plan to address inflation is not really what's going to fix the problem right now. And the other thing is that that plan is a long-term fix to inflation, not a short-term fix, and voters and Americans want to see a short-term fix.
A short-term fix before those November midterms, and the focus seems to very much be shifting from the pandemic to inflation, as you heard Kedevan just say. Gone are the days in the U.S. of $1,000 stimulus checks for all. Key senators seem set to block fresh public investment spending.
Throwing more fuel on the fire. We have inflation, and we have basically an economy that's on fire. You don't throw more fuel on a fire that's already on fire, causing the problems that we have.
So whether it's short-term or long-term, Kedevan Gorjestani, Joe Biden's not going to get his way by the sound of it.
No, it doesn't look like it, and you're seeing the Biden administration really acknowledging that fact that this huge Build Back Better plan is simply not going to become a reality anytime soon, or at least in that form. It seems that now they've moved to trying to pass little pieces of this Build Back Better because, as we heard, Senator Joe Manchin, he's pretty much the sole reason that this Build Back Better plan cannot pass the way it is written right now. But the Democrats are hoping that maybe a few parts of that Build Back Better plan could actually make it through on their own. The issue is, will Joe Manchin be on board with even some of these smaller parts? Because what you heard there in the soundbite from Senator Joe Manchin is something that he's basically been saying since the beginning of these talks about Build Back Better. He was always speaking about inflation and what that Build Back Better plan would do to inflation. And at the time, when they were really writing that bill, there was a question. They were waiting for a report to show whether that plan would increase inflation or not. And there's been some disagreement about whether or not this would make inflation worse or would actually not have any influence on inflation. For Joe Manchin, clearly it is a problem with inflation, and he doesn't want to spend more money. He doesn't want to add fuel to the fire. But at the same time, the Build Back Better plan could help Americans, could help their pockets, to help them have more money in their day-to-day lives, or to save money on things that are extremely expensive. And that is really the trials and tribulations of the Democrats and of the Biden administration.
Denis Ferrand, can you just explain for our viewers why, when we're having over on this side of the Atlantic inflation between 3 and 4%, it's 7.5% in the U.S.?
I think that, first of all, the impulse made by Biden as well as Trump administration before, the impulse through public spendings, through tax rebates, has been far more important in the US than it was the case in Europe and in France in particular. And the main reason for the increase of inflation is the gap between demand and supply that has occurred. First of all, it has been seen on durable goods. I think many pandemic-linked products such as cars has increased a lot when the pandemic was was over or quite over, and now this inflation is spreading in the whole kind of goods and services in the US. This is not. It's because mainly the demand has been probably too much stimulative. 2 years before, 1 year and a half before, you had a very interesting debate between Paul Krugman and Lawrence Summers, saying that, for example, Krugman said, no, this stimulation will not give inflation, and Lawrence Summers was far more cautious about this relation. And I think that in some respect, Lawrence Summers was right, and for sure, the too much stimulation of the economy has been translated in inflation, because the ability of the supply was not here, especially when you still have about 2 million people out of the workforce as compared to the pre-pandemic level. You don't have the ability to produce enough to answer to the increase of the demand. This is mainly a macroeconomic story, I think, in the US.
Mainly a macroeconomic story, but I'll put this to Philippe Vechter. A lot of that inflation is down to things like groceries and fuel. And I mean, we heard that clip there from a senator that represents a poor rural state, West Virginia. It's the same problem here in Europe. Those who live further away from places where they have access to public transportation are getting hit the hardest, perhaps?
Well, things are very similar, but very different at the same time. We see that energy contribution to the inflation rate has the same shape in Europe and the US. In Europe, in the Eurozone, it's about half of the inflation rate that is explained by energy. In the US, it's about 1/3. And the difference is that we have the contribution for goods and for services is about 1/3 too in the US. So you have a very important part of the inflation rate that is explained by the recovery plan that has been spent by the Biden and Trump before him, the Biden administration. We haven't had this type of recovery plan in Europe. And when you look at good prices or service prices, you do not have the same shape than in the US. So it's very different. We haven't had the pressure we've seen in the US on the internal market. And that's why the inflation rate is lower in Europe than in the US. And it has very important consequences on monetary policies. In Europe, we see that the ECB doesn't want to change its policy very rapidly, because it says, I have no ability to change the profile of the oil price or the electricity price, etc. So if I try to have a more monetary policy, it will have an impact immediately on the economic activity. In the US, it's very different. As the balance between the supply and demand is not exactly the same, a more restrictive monetary policy will have an impact on these unbalances, and that's why it's very different. We are not in the same world in the US and in Europe, because we have not had this type of recovery plan in Europe, contrary to what we've seen in the US.
And if there was a major de-escalation between Russia and Ukraine, right now the price of oil is still above $90 a barrel. Would that change anything?
I don't think so. Probably the risk today is that if we have a war, we could go at above $100 for a barrel. But we see that there is a very, the energy market has dramatically changed with the coronavirus crisis, because we are in a catch-up. So we have demand, a stronger demand. Okay, that push the price on the upside. But at the same time, we are in a situation where we have to look at the future. And in 2050, we need to have carbon neutrality. What is important for that? It means that when you are building pits for oil or things like that, they will be built for 30, 40, 50 years. So far after the 2050. So it means that you will think differently on your investment. So the energy market is dramatically changing now. And as you mentioned in introduction, we have on all these commodities that are associated with energy, oil on one side, gas, coal, but also cobalt and other. We will have a dramatic change in the behavior of market due to this target of carbon neutrality in 2050. So probably the oil price will remain high in coming months, even if the tension between Russia and Ukraine decreased dramatically.
Yeah, and again, we get back to this issue of wages. We saw at the outset that strike at a plant here in France. Last weekend, we saw cost of living protests in the UK. They've been relatively muted so far here in this French presidential election campaign, where what citizens tell pollsters doesn't seem to match what we're covering on the news, I got to say. Here you have, according to a poll out this week in French daily business daily Les Echos, about what is top of the minds of French voters, spending power, social spending, then comes crime and immigration, but then employment as some of the big topics there. So everyone tells us that wages, cost of living, the role of the state in social spending, that those are what's high on their minds. So Denis Ferrand, I know you're not a political scientist, but how come people are telling that to pollsters, but that's not what we're talking about, and we're just 2 months away from that election?
I think that when you're looking at the economic figure, you see, when you are talking to economists, they always say that the purchasing power of gross disposable income, of the income of people, has increased in the last few years. And it's right. But when you are dividing the evolution of the income by the evolution of demography, and I mean by the evolution of the number of households in France, the number of households is it's about 0.9% every year in addition. And when you're dividing the evolution of the income by the number of households, then you see that the level of incomes is the same as it was the case in 2010. So we didn't have any increase in revenue for now a decade. And it's only a mean. It implies that some people have seen an increase, and some people, and many, have seen a decrease in their revenue. So the very question, this is a political issue, but this is also an economic issue, the evolution of the revenue.
And on that score, Denis, we remember how the Yellow Vest protest began as a protest against a carbon tax, because there were people who needed their cars to get to work. Now that we're in the run-up to this presidential election, we were thinking last weekend, would there be, because there were also these so-called freedom convoys, like in Canada, that there might be some kind of a movement in the run-up to the election. It hasn't materialized. Are these issues between, again, those that are close to the center and those that are out in the periphery, and inequality there, going to surface over these last 2 months of the campaign?
Yeah. This is I think that there is kind of fear about this kind of movement. Remember how hard it was with the Yellow Vest movement, and it's not hazard if a premium for inflation has been introduced at the end of last year. I mean, this was a premium sent by the government of about €100 to any households in order to mitigate the impact of the inflation. And also, this is a very critical issue on different areas. For example, energy prices is far more important for people in rural area where you need your car to go to work or to go to restaurant or to go to make your to buy your furniture and anything else. It's about energy prices. Is about 15% of the income for a rural area. In urban area, this is about 5% the energy prices in the cost of energy in the revenue. So there is a very critical. You need to adopt a very peculiar, very specific answers to this kind of problems. And we only had a very general measure. A premium of €100, as I said. I'm not sure that this is a very critical, a very better answer that we can expect for such a problem.
All right, for this kind of a problem, so we've mentioned the fact that the pandemic has shown up energy dependence issues, supply chain issues. With the yellow vests, we had before even the pandemic that red flag of inequality when it comes to access for low-income earners to basic necessities. And then when the pandemic hit, remember 2 years ago, citizens didn't just clap for carers. They pledged to never again take for granted essential workers who keep our hospitals running, pick up the garbage, man the checkout counter at the supermarket. That was 2 years ago. I'll begin with you, Ketevan Gorjestani. 2 years on, those essential workers, have they been forgotten?
Well, it depends which of these essential workers you're talking about, because there has been an increase in wages, especially for those who have the lowest wages in, for example, the service industry, whether it's people who work in restaurants or in grocery stores, who, the cashiers, those who pack your groceries in bags. Those people, the lowest earners, have seen a certain increase in their wages. But if you think about the larger frontline workers, as you call them, for example, in the health care industry or in law enforcement, things like that, there you haven't really seen that increase. And of course, the focus is no longer on them if we move aside from the actual facts of whether they did get increase in wages. There's not so much talk about them right now as there was at the start of the pandemic, even though they while we seem to be slowly getting out and getting back to a certain sort of normal, they, at least here in the United States, are still feeling the brunt of that COVID pandemic. People who work in hospitals, whether they're nurses or doctors, they are still overwhelmed in much of the country, and they are still facing that wave of coronavirus. And we especially in the media, for example, are not so focused on them. At the same time, you have a lot of American workers who have either switched jobs or found jobs that pay better, decided to resign, shift completely their careers. It has even gotten a name here in the US, the Great Resignation. A lot of people have used this opportunity to maybe set their priorities straight as to what they wanted to do, how they wanted to do it, and what they were willing to sacrifice in favor of their jobs.
Yeah, before COVID hit, Ketevan, those who were at the lowest rung of the ladder often had to work 2-3 jobs. You had, in the United States, a minimum wage, a national minimum wage, which had not risen since 2009. Fast forward to today, that minimum wage is still at the same rate as it was over a decade ago.
Yes, and that is unlikely to change anytime soon, even though the Democrats, of course, would like to see that federal minimum wage increase. But a lot of states, especially smaller Republican states, really don't want to see that. Their argument is that if you put a minimum wage that you have in rich, bigger states that have large urban areas like New York City, for example, if you put a minimum wage that is high, something like $15 an hour, that cannot apply to a small town in Iowa, for example. And so that is their argument. Their argument is you can't apply the same minimum wage everywhere in the country. The Democrats, on the other hand, are saying that you cannot have a normal life and really cover your expenses on one job that pays the federal minimum wage, which is at $7.25. And they've tried to push for that. It hasn't worked. The Biden administration has increased it for federal workers, but before this can be applied to the country as a whole, it's going to take some time if it really ever happens, if the Republicans ever get really on board with it.
Philippe Vechter, we were warned before, at the outset of the pandemic. It was clear that this was going to accelerate the digital transformation, that this was going to disrupt the labor market, that the rich were going to get richer and the poor could get poorer. That prophecy has turned out to be true. What's going to happen in the long run, though? Is this sustainable on a social level?
Well, clearly it is not sustainable. What we clearly see is that during the pandemic, we have more unbalanced situation clearly, and not uniquely in terms of income, in terms of wealth, but also in terms of environment. When you're working in the banking sector, the risk on the labor market is low. This is not necessarily the case in other sectors, and we saw that in restaurants, in hotel, etc. So the risk on the labor market is also very different now, and probably the situation will continue to change. What we see, and clearly we see that in the U.S., we have very large discrepancies between poor people and rich people, the famous 1%, etc. And it seems to be very hard for a president to change the situation. Obama, when he was president, tried to change the situation. Biden tried also to change this point, but they do not succeed. And that's something that will have to probably to change if we want to be and to continue to be in a sustainable society. And what you mentioned about a yellow vest in France is very interesting. When we look at these yellow vests, we see that they are in a region, in a location where their future is very poor. Not in terms of money, but in terms of expectation. What can they expect in some region of France? Nothing. And at the same time, they have to move, as Denis mentioned it. They have to move to go to the grocery.
Just very briefly, Philippe, because we're running out of time, let me ask you, are you expecting these issues to be more of a conversation topic, or are we going to keep on basically talking about the brinkmanship of the far right, which is what we've seen on the campaign trail so far, questions about, immigration, Islam, this sort of thing. Is this what the campaign's going to be all about, or is that about to change?
No, it will not be about immigration. It's no longer the roots, the language, even of the far right and because it doesn't work. So I think that the main issue will be on purchasing power, on the role of France in the world, etc. But immigration is, from my perception, is not the real issue, the real source of the discussion in the campaign. It was the case 2 or 3 months ago. It's no longer the case, and we're waiting the topic Macron will mention when he will be a candidate for a new election.
All right, it will change once Emmanuel Macron announces formally his candidacy, you say. Philippe Vichtel, that'll be the final word. I want to thank you so much. I want to thank as well Denis Ferrand, our Washington correspondent, Kedevan Gorgestani. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.